ch4. Just like bumper cars. That's how the landing felt. There were a lot of jerks and jolts before the plane came to a standstill, and although the flight wasn't that long, around 3.5 hours to be specific. Once those wheels touched the runway, time seemed to pass like a sort of blur. It had raced by on the way to the airport, frozen in place on the plane, and now it seemed neither here nor there, like Abby was trapped in some kind of twilight zone. Like being in a living, breathing time-lapse video. Out of the tiny airplane window, everything had a sort of depressing concrete gray hue to it, but that could have been Abby projecting. When she looked back to the aisle, that was when she noticed that the mass exodus was happening. That was something that Abby never understood when it came to flying. That moment when the doors opened up, and everyone tried to get off the plane first, all at once. Almost as if it were some sort of screwed-up race, or like there was a prize given to the first 20 people off the aircraft. Abby waited until almost everybody else had cleared out first, before she grabbed the backpack at her feet and left her safe space at the window. It was official, they were here. Alaska, or Ted Stevens Airport in Anchorage, Alaska to be more specific. Another one of Abby's quirks when it came to air travel found its way to the surface. Simply put, she couldn't be the last one to get off the plane. Whenever she went on vacation with her parents, she had to try and get off before the last few stragglers. Something that drove her dad in particular around the twist. Not that she was one of the crazy ones, trying to force their way to the front, but Abby hated being off last. It was too embarrassing for words, being that last one off the plane. Someone had to be, she supposed. But the way that the flight attendants gave that certain look of understanding which just came off as pity, Abby couldn't deal with it. Their eyes full of sympathy, speculating that there must be some hysterical fear of flying at play, or something kooky like that. She supposed that they were just doing their job, but it would be nice if they weren't so condescending about it. Not for her benefit, not today. Abby had no intention of being the last person off, but someone would still fill that spot. With the slow creak of her head, it was such a relief to see that the vicious old bitch was already gone. Probably front of the line. Slowly, Abby slid along from the window seat to the empty aisle seat, slinging her backpack over her shoulder, from the seat she'd been sitting in, making sure that it was all zipped up and secure. Before tentatively waiting for a gap in the zombie-like line of people alighting the aircraft that she could slip into. Unfortunately, they were more walking dead than 28-day zombies. The momentary cool from the tiny little overhead fan gave Abby a much-needed burst of air to the face. Abby thought of herself as far from petite. She had a regular build, she supposed. Didn't stick too far out in front or behind, but figured that being the shape she was worked in her favor, as she was able to fill a diminutive gap in the line and take to the aisle with ease. While in the incredibly languid, almost snail-paced queue of procrastinators leaving the plane, it gave Abby time to scan her surroundings for mom and dad, but again they were nowhere to be seen. Maybe they're already off the plane, she supposed, knowing that just because she had her weird quirks about when and how it was appropriate to get off a plane, it didn't mean they had to share her queer idiosyncrasies. The second that she stepped off the plane and followed the flimsy steps down to the runway toward the spotlight-lined path that led to the terminal, Abby was hit by two things immediately. The first one being that neither mom nor dad had waited on her, which was fine. In her head, she'd expected that at least one of them would have waited for her. She wasn't a kid anymore, though. Those kind of expectations were on her, really. The second thing that hit Abby was just how fucking cold Alaska was. She wasn't sure why that surprised her so much. It was Alaska after all, but the breeze which carried the cold wind chilled her to the bone, and by the time she followed those dim spotlights that were lighting up the rapidly darkening evening, her ears felt as if they could fall off. A hat was definitely going to be a must here, at least until acclimation had kicked in. There wasn't much to see out there on the runway. Before alighting the aircraft, Abby had thought that she might take a few minutes to marvel at the scenery surrounding the airport for a moment, but it was too dark and cold. All that she could see were rows upon rows of planes, and the shadows between the paths of spotlights grew into a void-filled, pitch blackness. Without wasting another moment, Abby headed inside, trying her best to avoid the particularly cold blasts of wind, which forced her to cover her face as she walked briskly to the automatic doors of the terminal. Before they could be on their way, she knew that there was a case from the baggage carousel before anything else. That, and she'd need to locate her parents. An unknown length of time passed as she walked, and made her way there to baggage claim, following the long plain corridors with various doors that were off-limits past the sterile white walls, which had adverts for various things to do in Alaska all over them. The amount of selling out that those walls were doing made it seem like they were Anchorage's whore. Before long, Abby was stood there, almost like she was in some kind of trance, just like everybody else, watching every single other case that passed by, even though some were different shapes and colors. Something else that Abby supposed was part of the airport ritual. Until her own one came into view, that was the navy blue soft material case, the one that had a bright yellow ribbon tied around the handle so that could be distinguished it from the other cases of its type. She'd know it anywhere. Without catching sight of her mom or dad still, Abby kept going. Not that she was looking particularly hard. It occurred to her that if they weren't willing to leave her in Seattle, then they wouldn't depart the airport without her. She slid her, now somewhat sweaty, headphones back onto her head, and when one of the front windows to Ted Stevens lay in front of her, Abby found herself awestruck for the first time since she got there. So much so, that it was only then she remembered that she was still wearing her old face mask, bundling it quickly into her back jeans pocket. What lay before her was truly quite beautiful, even if that assessment was somewhat grudged in her own head for getting over Seattle so quickly. There was so much green, not at all what had been envisioned when she thought of Alaska. She'd been so trapped in her own naivete, picturing white everywhere and deer or elk crossing the middle of a busy city street, rivers a stone's throw from the city center where wild bears would catch salmon swimming upriver. The whole thing some bizarro nature conservationist's wet dream. She just couldn't get over that green, though. Abby knew that places like Iceland were all green. She'd seen photos of that before, but didn't know what she was expecting from Anchorage. Before she had the chance to slip her phone from out of her jeans pocket and take a quick picture, though, she felt her mom's arms wrapped tightly around her waist from behind, and welcomed the embrace. She had been drinking. That much was obvious, but Abby didn't say anything about that. It couldn't have been easy for her. None of this was easy. "Are you okay, pumpkin?" she asked, with a big sloppy kiss on the side of Abby's head. Sarah more than likely got a mouthful of Abby's matted and unwashed hair for her trouble. From her proximity, Abby could smell the combination of cheap wine and something meat-based on her breath. "I'm fine," she managed, which was neither here nor there. "How was your flight? Did you make any friends? Any nice boys?" Whenever Sarah started getting tipsy, Abby thought that it was as if her mom had reverted back to some earlier time in her life. The way she spoke, all giggles and cringe. Almost seeming to forget that her daughter wasn't a little girl anymore. It would honestly have been condescending, had it come from anyone other than her mom. From her. Abby thought it kind of adorable. Sarah was funny and cute when she was tipsy, just not when she got past that stage and everything became a bit of a downer. Nobody bothered you, did they? Abby loved that Sarah was concerned about her. She knew that her mom was always going to have her back or be in her corner. Part of her began to wonder if Sarah had come to check on her from afar, and she just hadn't noticed as her eyes were closed so tightly. With a quick glance, Abby could tell that her dad was listening in while doing his very best to pretend he was busy on his phone and oblivious to the conversation she was having with her mother. In the moment, the decision not to tell them about the bully that she'd been forced to endure seemed like the best option. Nor did she want to tell them how she'd felt pressured into wearing a face mask when she didn't want to. It wasn't because she was afraid of being told that she should stand up for herself, or people would forever be walking over her all of her life. Or that her alcohol-assured mother would head to the nearest kiosk to complain about the cabin crew and flight attendants and how they just let one passenger bully and intimidate another. In truth, Abby didn't want to add any more guilt into the fucked-up melting pot that was her family at the present moment. Nope, no problems at all. She cheerfully deflected, lying through her teeth. Abby was pretty sure that her dad knew she wasn't telling the truth. The way that he looked up from his phone for the briefest of moments to almost examine her, before he looked back to it again, was very telling. She was just glad that her mom believed her bullshit. "So what do you think of Alaska then, Abby?" Blindsided would have been an understatement to how she felt in that moment. Apart from buying her the Seattle sweater at the airport, before they started their trip, Abby and Pete weren't really talking. At all. Yet there he was, trying to pass small talk with her like nothing had happened. Whatever expectations he had, that they would land and everyone would be happy, smiling and best friends again, they belonged in the realm of fantasy. Especially since Abby hadn't had a choice in coming here. All that she could do was tell him that it wasn't as white as she was expecting. It was frank, honest, and matter-of-fact, like most things had been the last week or two. Frank and plain was the best she could do right now, as Abby tried her hardest not to make it obvious on the outside just how much she despised him a passion on the inside. What were you expecting? The North Pole? That heat was building up again as soon as Pete said that. He really was an idiot. Abby supposed that she was meant to love him unconditionally because he was her dad, and all of that corny crap, but he'd really hurt her, and Abby did not want to speak to him right then. Needless to say, she didn't answer. After that unusual, awkward silence crept between them all again, the one that had been more and more common lately, Abby could see him fidgeting again. It was so unlike them as a family. Normally, there would always be something to talk about. Her mom was always so soulful, and would forever be telling Abby and Pete about some herbal healing remedy. Or an article she read about better circulation, the dangers of eating and drinking certain things, or let them know when a certain pagan or ancient holiday was coming up. He would tell those unbelievably bad dad jokes, though these days the only dad joke. As for Abby, she'd fill in the gaps with anything and everything. Right then, in that moment in front of Anchorage's beauty, framed by giant panes of glass, she just didn't feel up to it. Abby was drained and hungry and very possibly hangry. She was also fed up with seeing Ted Stevens Airport already, and enduring the knocks and accidental collisions of people not looking where they were going. She had no energy for that last leg of the airport ritual. Rather than people watching, Abby just wanted them to open their fucking eyes and look where the fuck they were going. "Are we ready to go then?" he asked with an expectant tone of voice that just breathed impatience. Regardless of how they felt about one another in that moment, they both had a shared desire to be on their way. "It sure looks like it." He gave her a look in reply to my sassy answer. Sometimes Abby felt that he was trying to find faults in her. Like nothing she would ever do at that moment in time was good enough, so it didn't matter whether she was a total ass or not. Despite her self-justification and sass, she could see a perturbed anxiety begin to form in her mom's eyes and backed off from attacking her father. Even though she had a dozen more retorts prepared, ready to unleash them like a salvo from a warship if required, it wouldn't be long before they threw down again. It wasn't necessarily something that either of them wanted. To make a spectacle of themselves in an airport lobby would do nothing for her, and likely only hurt Sarah. After a particularly unloquacious moment, Pete let out a fed-up and jaded sigh. Seconds later, he cleared his throat and pointed out towards the entrance. "I think we'll get a cab to our hotel on University Lake Drive." Pete began to instruct. Right then, he was really starting to piss Abby off again. His vague wording of "I think" was enough to set her off. "You think?" She ruminated hesitantly. "That's some great planning there. Fucking hell." Gripping onto her left wrist again tightly was all that Abby could do to not explode. "We can get a change of clothes, grab dinner, and have an early night." Sarah nodded at his suggestion, leaving Abby to grudgingly accept that it was agreeable. The urge to tell him that even a broken clock is right twice a day was overpowering. In her head, Abby had already left the airport amidst repeated mutterings of "excuse me" and disingenuous apologies. Every so often, squeezing through gaps in the crowd as tardy people didn't so much brush or knock, as they did blatantly shove. Clumsy and inconsiderate Neanderthals all. A gentle squeeze on the sleeve of her Seattle top from her mom brought Abby back to reality though, and still being in the exact same spot as before, while Pete continued to go on and on. In an effort to make the leap from dreams to reality, she began to march straight out the doors, without so much as a word, toward the line of vacant cabs that sat there dormant. When Abby heard her mom ask him what the plan was for tomorrow though, she rolled her eyes, glad that her back was to them and neither saw her do it. Hungry and eager for a diversion, she just really wanted to lay down flat on a hotel bed and have 5 minutes to herself. It didn't matter how uncomfortable it was. It could be made of cinder blocks for all she cared. All that Abby knew was that it was taking fucking forever to leave this shitty airport. "I thought that we'd have a full day of sightseeing tomorrow." Pete began. Obviously, he had given it some thought. "The day after we'll be setting off early with a hire car if we want to get to Ember Falls for a decent time." "That sounds like fun, doesn't it, Abby?" "Darling?" Sarah asked with strained and sham optimism to her voice. Abby knew that she was trying to involve her in the conversation and keep them both engaged. Although it would have been said through gritted teeth had she uttered it aloud, Abby did think that it wasn't the worst idea in the world. She wouldn't mind seeing Anchorage before they set off again. "Sure," Abby said. It was abrupt and she knew it was. Part of her wanted to seem like she was being ungrateful. It didn't matter how amazing his plan was. She wasn't ready to show that she was actually quite excited to explore Anchorage early in the morning. "Okay then, let's get that cab," he grumbled before moving off, taking the lead, finding a route straight to the automatic doors without much resistance, which annoyed Abby a little, a small part of her willing him to be shoved about. Abby wanted to chase after him, to give him the biggest hug. She didn't like being a massive bitch to her dad, but at the same time, she wanted to hurt him. She wanted to hurt him badly and make him cry because he had fucking broke her heart, and she'd never forgive him.